They patted my hand and spoke in those soft, patronizing voices people use when they think you can't understand anymore. "Poor Grandma Dot," my daughter-in-law Karen whispered to my son Michael. "Her eyes are getting so bad she can barely see the bills anymore. They thought I couldn't hear them from the kitchen, thought I was too old and too blind to notice what they were really doing." But here's the thing about getting older in Mississippi. We may move a little slower, but we see a lot clearer than folks give us credit for. And when I finally opened my eyes to what they were up to, well, let's just say they learned real quick that this old woman could see well enough to make them go broke. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Williams, but everyone's called me Dot since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. I'm 73 years old, and I've lived my whole life here in Mississippi, most of it in a little house by the Leaf River in Hattiesburg. For 42 years, I worked as a head teller at First National Bank downtown, where I learned that numbers don't lie, but people sure do. I raised my boy Michael after his daddy passed when he was just 12, worked double shifts to put him through college, and saved every penny I could so he'd have something to build on. After I retired in 2010, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. I had my garden, my church ladies' auxiliary, and my weekly poker game with the other retired bank ladies. We called ourselves the River Rats because we all lived near the water, and we had a saying, "Trust your instincts, count your money twice, and never let anyone tell you what you can't see with your own two eyes." Those words would prove more important than I ever imagined. Michael married Karen in 2015, a pretty blonde woman from Jackson, who had big dreams and even bigger spending habits. She was sweet as pie when they were dating, always complimenting my cooking and asking for my recipes. But something shifted after the wedding. The visits became less frequent, and when they did come around, Karen would walk through my house with this look on her face, like she was calculating something. She'd run her finger along my furniture and comment on how vintage everything was, how quaint my little house seemed. They had 2 children, Emma and Tyler, who I adored more than anything in this world. Emma was 16, smart as a whip, and wanted to be a veterinarian. Tyler was 14, quiet like his grandfather had been, and had a talent for drawing that took my breath away. Every month, I'd put a little money aside for their college funds, just like I'd done for their daddy. It wasn't much, but over the years it had grown into something substantial. The first sign of trouble came last spring, when Michael showed up at my door unannounced on a Tuesday morning. I was out in my garden, tending to my tomatoes, when I heard his car pull into the driveway. He never visited on weekdays anymore. Too busy with work, he always said, so I knew something was up. He walked over to where I was kneeling by the tomato plants, and I could see worry lines creased deep around his eyes. "Mama," he said, and I noticed he was using that careful voice people use when they're about to deliver bad news. "We need to talk about something important." I brushed the dirt off my hands and followed him to the back porch, where we sat in the same wooden chairs his daddy had built 30 years ago. Michael fidgeted with his car keys while he talked, avoiding my eyes. He said Karen had been noticing things when they visited, little things that concerned them. How I'd seemed confused about dates sometimes, how I'd mentioned paying bills that they weren't sure I'd actually paid, how I'd lost my reading glasses 3 times in one afternoon. "We're worried about you living alone out here, Mama," he said. "What if something happened? What if you fell, or forgot to turn off the stove, or couldn't see well enough to manage your finances?" I listened to every word, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. After 4 decades of working at a bank, I had seen this conversation before. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Adult children, concerned about aging parents, worried about money and property and who was going to manage what. Sometimes the concern was genuine, sometimes it wasn't. "My eyes are fine, honey," I told him, keeping my voice steady. "Dr. Peterson checked them just last month. I've got reading glasses for the small print, but there's nothing wrong with my vision that can't be fixed with a good pair of specs." Michael nodded, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. He had that look people get when they've already made up their minds about something and are just going through the motions of a conversation. "We just think it might be time to consider some changes," he said. "Maybe think about moving closer to us, or at least letting us help more with your finances. Karen's really good with numbers, and she could take some of the burden off your shoulders." Karen, good with numbers. That almost made me laugh out loud. This was the same woman who'd bought a $30,000 SUV without telling Michael, then acted surprised when the payment put them behind on their mortgage. The same woman who'd spent $800 on throw pillows for their living room because the decorator said they brought the room together. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I told Michael I'd think about what he'd said, and sent him home with a jar of my peach preserves and a promise to call if I needed anything. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my checkbook, going through everything with a fine-tooth comb. My bills were paid, my accounts balanced to the penny, and my investment statements were organized in neat folders just like they'd been for the past 20 years. There wasn't a thing wrong with my record keeping, and there sure wasn't anything wrong with my eyesight. But something was definitely wrong with this picture. Over the next few weeks, the visits became more frequent. Karen would drop by with the children, always finding some excuse to wander through my house while Emma and Tyler played in the yard. She'd comment on how dark it seemed inside, how I really should consider getting better lighting. "It's so hard to see anything clearly in here," she'd say, squinting dramatically at my perfectly legible calendar on the refrigerator. "Don't you think so, kids? Isn't it hard for Grandma Dot to see things clearly?" Emma, bless her heart, would look confused and say, "But Grandma, you just read us that whole story without your glasses." Tyler would nod in agreement, but Karen would just laugh and pat my hand like I was a child who'd said something amusing. "Oh, Grandma's just being brave," she'd say. "We all know her eyes aren't what they used to be." The pattern became clear pretty quickly. Every visit included some comment about my failing eyesight, some suggestion about how difficult it must be for me to manage things on my own, some offer to help with my paperwork or my bills. Michael would nod along, looking genuinely concerned, while Karen would make little notes in a leather portfolio she'd started carrying around. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a hot Thursday in June, and I'd driven into town to run some errands. I'd just finished at the grocery store and was walking to my car when I heard familiar voices from across the parking lot. Michael and Karen were standing by their SUV, talking in low voices, and something about their posture made me stop and listen. "She's getting worse," Karen was saying, her voice carrying across the humid air. "Did you see how she squinted at that receipt yesterday? She can barely make out the numbers anymore." "Are you sure about this?" Michael asked, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "She seems fine to me most of the time." "Trust me," Karen said, and her voice had an edge to it I'd never heard before. "I know what I'm seeing. And Dr. Peterson is an old fool anyway. What does he know about eyes? We need to get her to see someone who'll give us documentation. Something we can use when we petition for conservatorship." Conservatorship. The word hit me like a physical blow. I stood there in the Mississippi heat, grocery bags growing heavy in my hands, while the full scope of what was happening became crystal clear. They weren't worried about my eyesight. They were building a case to take control of my finances. "The house alone is worth $300,000 now," Karen continued. "And you said she's got at least that much again in savings and investments. We could sell the house, move her into one of those senior communities, and use the money to pay off our debts and get the kids set up for college." "I don't know," Michael said, but his voice was weakening. "It feels wrong, taking her house." "We're not taking anything," Karen snapped. "We're helping her. She can't manage on her own anymore, Michael. You've seen how confused she gets. And what happens when she really can't see anymore? What happens when she falls down those porch steps? Or drives into someone because she can't see the road? We'd be negligent not to step in." I stood there for another minute listening to them plan out my future like I was already dead and buried. Then I quietly loaded my groceries into my car, drove home, and started making some plans of my own. That evening I called my old friend Margaret, who'd worked in the bank's legal department before she retired. Margaret had always been sharper than a tack, and she knew more about elder law than most lawyers. I told her what I'd overheard, And there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. "Oh, honey," she finally said, "you're in trouble, real trouble. If they can get a doctor to say you're not competent to manage your affairs, they can petition the court for conservatorship. Once that happens, they control everything. Your money, your property, your decisions. And getting it reversed is nearly impossible." "But there's nothing wrong with my eyes," I protested. "Dr. Peterson will testify to that. Dr. Peterson's 82 years old, and half the county thinks he should have retired years ago," Margaret said bluntly. "If they take you to some specialist in Jackson, someone who doesn't know you, and they present you as a confused old woman whose son is concerned about her safety, well, it's not hard to paint a picture." We talked for another hour, and by the time I hung up, I had a clearer understanding of what I was up against. But I also had something else, a plan that was starting to form in the back of my mind. After 42 years of watching people try to manipulate money and get away with it, I'd learned a thing or two about turning the tables. The next morning, I drove to Jackson to see an attorney Margaret had recommended, a sharp young woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in elder law. Patricia listened to my story with the kind of focused attention that told me she'd heard similar tales before. "Mrs. Williams," she said when I finished, "what you're describing is called financial elder abuse, and it's more common than you might think. The good news is that Mississippi has strong laws protecting against it. The challenging news is that prevention is always easier than prosecution." She explained that I had several options. I could set up an irrevocable trust that would protect my assets from any future conservatorship attempts. I could document my mental competency with multiple physicians and keep those records with multiple attorneys. Or I could do something more creative, something that would not only protect me but teach my son and daughter-in-law a lesson they'd never forget. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. Patricia smiled, and I liked her immediately. "Well," she said, "if they want to play games with your eyesight and your competency, maybe it's time to show them just how clearly you can see what they're really after." I left Patricia's office that day with a folder full of documents and a plan that would have made my old poker-playing friends proud. It was risky, it was complicated, and it was going to require me to do some acting that would challenge my Methodist upbringing. But if Michael and Karen wanted to treat me like a confused old woman, I was going to give them exactly what they expected, right up until the moment I pulled the rug out from under them. The first part of the plan was the hardest. I had to start acting like my eyesight really was failing. Not dramatically, not obviously, but in small ways that would confirm what Karen was already telling everyone. I started squinting at things I could see perfectly well. I began asking for help, reading receipts and restaurant menus. I bought a magnifying glass and made sure to use it conspicuously whenever they were around. The performance felt wrong in every fiber of my being. I'd been independent my whole life, and pretending to be helpless went against everything I believed in. But every time I wavered, I reminded myself of Karen's words in that parking lot, of the way she'd talked about selling my house and moving me into some facility like I was a piece of furniture they needed to store somewhere. Within 2 weeks, my deteriorating condition became the talk of their household. Karen would call every few days to check on me, her voice dripping with false concern. "How are your eyes today, Grandma Dot?" she'd ask. "Are you having trouble seeing the numbers on your bills? Maybe Michael and I should come over and help you sort through your paperwork." I'd sigh and admit that yes, things were getting a bit blurry, and maybe some help would be nice. Karen's excitement was barely contained. She'd arrive with her leather portfolio and a stack of forms, ready to organize my finances for me. But here's what she didn't know. Before every visit, I'd already copied every relevant document and stored the originals in Patricia's office. The papers Karen was so eager to examine were carefully prepared duplicates, and some of the numbers weren't quite what they seemed. The bank statements she saw showed my accounts, but not the new ones I'd opened in Jackson. The investment portfolio she photographed was real, but it didn't include the trust fund I'd established with Patricia's help. And the property deed she was so interested in had been quietly transferred to an irrevocable trust that named Emma and Tyler as beneficiaries, with specific provisions that would make Karen's head spin if she ever found out about them. Meanwhile, I was gathering evidence of my own. Every conversation was recorded on a small device Patricia had recommended. Every visit was documented with precise notes about what Karen looked at, what she photographed, and what questions she asked. I was building a case that would prove financial elder abuse, And I was doing it while maintaining the perfect facade of a confused old woman who couldn't see well enough to know what was happening to her. The hardest part was watching Michael go along with it all. My boy, who I'd raised to be honest and decent, was letting his wife convince him that stealing from his mother was somehow an act of love. There were moments when I wanted to shake him, to ask him what his father would think of what he was doing. But I held my tongue and stuck to the plan. Because Dorothy Williams hadn't spent 4 decades handling other people's money without learning a few things about patience, strategy, and the element of surprise. And when the time came to show them exactly how clearly I could see, it was going to be a lesson they'd never forget. The charade had to be perfect, and perfection required practice. Every morning I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and rehearsed the squint, the hesitant reach for objects, the confused look when examining papers. It felt like betraying everything my mama had taught me about standing tall and facing the world head-on. But this was war, and sometimes war requires camouflage. By mid-July, Karen's visits had increased to twice a week. She'd arrive with that saccharine smile and her leather portfolio, always carrying some excuse about checking on my well-being. One Tuesday, she brought what she called a vision test she'd printed from the internet, claiming she was just worried and wanted to make sure I was okay. I sat at my kitchen table, deliberately holding the paper too close to my face, squinting at letters I could read perfectly from 3 feet away. "Oh my," I said, letting my voice quaver just slightly. "These are awfully small, aren't they? I can barely make out the E on the top line." Karen's eyes lit up like Christmas morning. She made careful notes in her portfolio, writing down everything I pretended I couldn't see. What she didn't know was that I was making notes of my own later, documenting every lie, every manipulation, every piece of evidence that would eventually hang them both. The following week, Michael called to schedule what he termed a, quote, family meeting. His voice sounded strained, like a man who'd been arguing with his wife and lost. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, when the Mississippi heat was thick enough to swim through, both of them dressed like they were going to church or court. Karen carried a manila folder thick with papers, and Michael kept clearing his throat like he had something stuck in it. We sat in my living room, the same room where I'd rocked Michael to sleep as a baby, where I'd helped him with homework, where I'd held him when he cried after his daddy's funeral. The irony wasn't lost on me that this was where they'd chosen to try to steal my independence. "Mama?" Michael began, his hands clasped so tight his knuckles were white. "We've been talking, and we really think it's time to make some changes. Your eyesight issues are getting worse, and we're scared something's going to happen." I nodded slowly, playing the part of the concerned grandmother. "What kind of changes, honey?" Karen leaned forward, her smile practiced and predatory. "Well, Dorothy, we think it would be best if you let us help manage some of your financial responsibilities, just until we can get your vision sorted out with a specialist. I've found a wonderful doctor in Jackson who specializes in age-related vision problems." Age-related. The way she said it made it sound like a disease, something shameful that happened to people who were too old to matter anymore. I let my shoulders slump a little, as if the weight of my supposed helplessness was settling on me. "I suppose that makes sense," I said carefully, "but I've been managing my own money since I was 16 years old. It feels strange to hand that over to someone else." "Oh, you wouldn't be handing it over," Michael said quickly, though his eyes didn't meet mine. "We'd just be helping. Karen's really good with finances, and she could make sure all your bills get paid on time, that your investments are properly managed." Karen nodded enthusiastically. "And we'd give you a monthly allowance for your personal expenses, of course. You wouldn't have to worry about anything. We could even look into selling this house and finding you a nice apartment closer to us, somewhere with better lighting and easier maintenance." There it was, the end game laid out as plain as day. Sell my house, control my money, reduce me to a monthly allowance like a child. I felt anger rise in my chest, hot and fierce, but I pushed it down and continued my performance. "I don't know," I said, letting my voice shake a little. "This house has so many memories. Your daddy and I brought you home from the hospital to this house, Michael." "I know, Mama, but think about how much easier life would be. No more worrying about yard work or repairs, or whether you're paying the right bills to the right companies. We could take care of everything. Karen pulled out a sheaf of papers from her folder. "I've taken the liberty of preparing some preliminary paperwork, just to get the process started. Nothing major, just some basic financial power of attorney documents and a few other forms." She spread the papers across my coffee table like a dealer laying out cards. I squinted at them, leaning forward as if struggling to read the print. What I saw made my blood run cold and my resolve strengthen at the same time. These weren't simple power of attorney documents. Karen had prepared papers that would give them immediate control over my bank accounts, my investments, my property, everything. There were forms to initiate conservatorship proceedings, documents that would declare me mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs, and agreements that would give them the right to make medical and financial decisions on my behalf. "These look very complicated," I said, picking up one of the papers and holding it at arm's length, then closer to my face, as if trying to find the right distance to read it. "I can barely make out the words. What exactly am I signing?" "Just standard protection documents," Karen said smoothly. "Things that will make sure you're taken care of if your condition worsens. Really, Dorothy, it's for your own good. For my own good." How many terrible things had been done throughout history under that banner? I set the papers down carefully, as if they were too heavy for my trembling hands. "Could I have some time to think about this? Maybe have my attorney look these over?" Karen's smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh, I don't think that's necessary. These are very standard documents, and honestly, legal fees would just be a waste of your money. Money you'll need for your medical care." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Some part of him, the part that was still my little boy, knew this was wrong. But he'd been worn down by Karen's constant pressure, her insistence that they were saving me from myself. "I'd still like to have Mr. Henderson take a look," I said, referring to the elderly lawyer who'd handled my will years ago. "He's been my attorney for 20 years, and he never charges me much for simple reviews." "Mr. Henderson is 85 years old, Mama," Michael said. "Are you sure he's the best person to advise you on this?" "He's been practicing law longer than Karen's been alive," I replied with a slight edge to my voice that I hoped they'd attribute to confusion rather than irritation. "I trust his judgment." Karen's lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, if that's what you want. But Dorothy, time really is of the essence here. What if something happens while we're waiting for lawyers to shuffle papers around? What if you fall, or have an accident, or make a financial mistake that costs you thousands of dollars?" The scare tactics were as transparent as glass, but I played along. "You're right, I suppose. These old bones aren't getting any stronger. Maybe I should sign now and let Mr. Henderson review copies later?" "That's very sensible," Karen said, pulling a pen from her purse. "We can get these filed right away and give you peace of mind." I reached for the pen with a trembling hand that wasn't entirely an act. Even though I knew these documents would never see the inside of a courthouse, even though Patricia had already helped me prepare countermeasures for every trick Karen was trying to pull, it still felt like a violation to watch my own family try to steal my life out from under me. But I needed them to think they'd won. I needed them to get confident, to stop being careful, to reveal the full scope of their plan. So I signed my name to those papers, my signature deliberately shaky and uncertain, while inside my head I was already composing the testimony I'd give when this all came to court. Karen gathered up the signed documents with barely concealed glee. "You've made the right decision, Dorothy. We'll get these filed first thing Monday morning, and then we can start making some real improvements to your situation." After they left, I sat in my living room for a long time, staring at the coffee table where I'd just signed away my rights. Except I hadn't, really. The documents I'd signed were worthless. Patricia had made sure of that. The names of the financial institutions were slightly wrong, the account numbers were transposed, and the notary section had been deliberately left incomplete. But Karen and Michael didn't know that. As far as they were concerned, they now owned me. The next phase of my investigation began that evening. I called Patricia and gave her a full report of the afternoon's events. She listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of disgust. "They're moving faster than I expected," she said when I finished. "Usually, these schemes take months to unfold. They must be more desperate than we thought." "What's our next move?" "We document everything. Every conversation, Every action they take based on those fake papers they think give them authority. The more aggressive they get, the stronger our case becomes. I spent the next week playing the role of the helpless elderly woman while secretly documenting every move Karen and Michael made. They wasted no time in putting their plan into action. Karen called Monday morning to inform me that she'd spoken with my bank and arranged to have all my statements sent directly to her address. She'd also made an appointment for me with an eye doctor in Jackson for the following Friday. Dr. Morrison specializes in severe vision loss in elderly patients, she said, her voice syrupy with false concern. He's going to do a complete evaluation and give us a professional assessment of your condition. What Karen didn't know was that Patricia had already researched Dr. Morrison. He had a reputation for being a little too willing to accommodate family members who needed medical documentation for legal proceedings. His license had been questioned twice by the state medical board, and several of his former patients had filed complaints about misdiagnoses that seemed designed to support conservatorship cases. I agreed to the appointment with the appropriate amount of grateful confusion, then immediately called Patricia to let her know what was happening. She arranged for me to see her own eye specialist the day before Karen's appointment, a respected physician who would document my perfect vision and provide testimony if needed. Meanwhile, Karen had begun her assault on my financial independence. She called my bank, my investment advisor, and my insurance company, introducing herself as my care coordinator, and requesting detailed information about my accounts. Most of the institutions properly refused to discuss my private information with her, but a few were willing to talk based on her authoritative tone and claims about my incompetence. I knew about every one of these calls because Patricia had helped me set up monitoring systems for all my accounts. Anytime someone accessed my information or attempted to make changes, I received immediate notification. It was fascinating and terrifying to watch Karen work, to see how skillfully she manipulated people's natural inclination to help a concerned family member. Thursday evening, Karen called to go over the details for Friday's doctor's appointment. She'd drive, she said, since my vision was too poor for me to be behind the wheel. She'd also sit in on the consultation to make sure I understood everything the doctor told me. I've prepared a list of symptoms to discuss with Dr. Morrison, she said. I've been keeping track of all the vision problems you've been having lately, and I want to make sure he gets a complete picture. I'll bet she had. I could only imagine what fictional symptoms she'd concocted to support her narrative of my declining capabilities, but I expressed gratitude for her thoroughness and agreed to let her handle all the details. That night, I reviewed the plan Patricia and I had developed for the doctor's visit. The fake appointment with Dr. Morrison would proceed as scheduled, but we'd be ready with documentation of the truth. Patricia had arranged for a court stenographer to be present in Dr. Morrison's waiting room, ostensibly there for another case, but actually recording everything that happened during my visit. Friday morning arrived gray and humid, with the kind of oppressive heat that made the air feel solid. Karen picked me up at 9 o'clock sharp, chattering nervously about how helpful Dr. Morrison was going to be, how he'd help us develop a treatment plan for my condition. The drive to Jackson took 45 minutes, during which Karen continued to coach me on what to tell the doctor. I should mention how hard it was to read, she said, how I'd been having trouble distinguishing colors, how I'd nearly fallen several times because I couldn't see obstacles clearly. Remember, Dorothy, this is about getting you the help you need. Dr. Morrison needs to understand how serious your vision problems have become, so he can recommend the right treatment. Treatment. As if there were any treatment needed for the fictional condition she'd invented for me. I nodded and made appropriate worried sounds while secretly recording every word she said. Dr. Morrison's office was in a medical complex that looked expensive and important, all marble floors and dark wood paneling. The waiting room was full of elderly patients, most of whom looked genuinely confused and frail. I felt like an imposter among them, a healthy woman pretending to be sick in order to catch her family stealing from her. When my name was called, Karen immediately stood up to accompany me. I'm Mrs. Williams' daughter-in-law, she announced to the nurse. I've been coordinating her care, and I need to be present to help her understand the doctor's instructions. The nurse looked at me questioningly, and I nodded with what I hoped looked like resigned acceptance. Karen's been so helpful, I said. I don't know what I'd do without her. Dr. Morrison's office was dimly lit, which should have been my first red flag. An eye doctor who kept his office dark was either incompetent or deliberately creating conditions that would make vision tests more difficult. He was a thin man in his 60s with nervous hands and eyes that didn't quite meet mine when he spoke. "Mrs. Williams," he said, consulting a chart that somehow already contained information about me, despite this being my first visit, "I understand you've been having some significant vision problems." Before I could answer, Karen jumped in. "Oh, Dr. Morrison, it's been terrible. Dorothy can barely read anymore. She can't see well enough to drive safely, and she's been making mistakes with her finances because she can't see the numbers clearly." Dr. Morrison nodded sympathetically and began his examination. The eye chart was positioned at an unusual angle, making it genuinely difficult to read. The lighting was adjusted several times during the test, always in ways that made vision more challenging. When I read the letters correctly despite these obstacles, Dr. Morrison seemed surprised and adjusted the conditions again. He said, making notes in his chart. "There does seem to be some significant impairment here. Mrs. Williams, are you able to make out the numbers on this financial statement?" He handed me a document that I recognized as one of my own bank statements, though I had no idea how he'd obtained it. The print was smaller than usual, and he'd positioned it so that the light created a glare across the numbers. I squinted at it, pretending to struggle while actually noting every detail of this orchestrated performance. "It's very difficult," I said. "The numbers all seem to blur together." "Yes, I can see that," Dr. Morrison said, making more notes. "This level of impairment would certainly make financial management very challenging." Karen leaned forward eagerly. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, would Dorothy be capable of managing her own finances in this condition?" "Well," Dr. Morrison said carefully, "severe vision impairment can certainly impact a person's ability to handle complex financial tasks. Reading bank statements, writing checks, distinguishing between different bills, these all become very difficult when vision is compromised. So you'd recommend that someone else handle those responsibilities for her? In cases like this, family assistance with financial matters is often advisable." I sat quietly, listening to them discuss my supposed incompetence, as if I weren't in the room. The entire consultation was a sham, a piece of theater designed to provide medical justification for Karen's planned theft. But I let it play out, gathering evidence with every fraudulent word. When the appointment ended, Dr. Morrison handed Karen a written report that declared my vision severely compromised and recommended family assistance with daily tasks requiring clear sight, including financial management. The report was dated and signed, a piece of medical fraud that would look very impressive to a judge who didn't know the real story. On the drive home, Karen could barely contain her excitement. "You see, Dorothy, I knew Dr. Morrison would be able to help us understand your condition. Now we have professional documentation of your vision problems, and we can make sure you get all the support you need." Support. Such a nice word for theft. I thanked her for her concern and her help, playing the grateful elderly victim while mentally composing the criminal complaint I'd be filing against both her and Dr. Morrison. That evening, I called Patricia with a full report of the day's events. She listened with growing anger, occasionally interrupting with questions about specific details. "This is even worse than we anticipated," she said when I finished. "Dr. Morrison has basically committed medical fraud, and Karen has orchestrated the whole thing. We have them dead to rights. What happens next?" "Next, we let them think they've won. They'll get aggressive now, start making moves on your property and your accounts. The more they steal, the stronger our case becomes." "Can you hold on a little longer, Dorothy? I know this is hard." It was hard. Harder than I'd expected. Not just the pretending, but watching my own son participate in my destruction. Michael wasn't the mastermind. That was clearly Karen. But he was complicit. He was letting it happen, and that broke my heart in ways I hadn't anticipated. But I was Dorothy Williams, and I'd been fighting battles my whole life. I'd raised a son alone after my husband died. I'd worked my way up from junior teller to head of the department in a bank that had never promoted a woman before. I'd survived the recession of 2008, Hurricane Katrina, and 42 years of dealing with people who thought they could cheat the system. Karen and Michael had picked the wrong old lady to mess with. They thought they were hunting a helpless deer, but they'd actually cornered a Mississippi alligator. And this alligator was about to show them just how sharp her teeth still were. The morning after the fraudulent doctor's appointment, I woke up feeling different, not defeated, not scared, but focused in a way I hadn't felt since my banking days, when we'd catch someone trying to forge a check. There's a particular clarity that comes when you stop being the victim and start being the hunter, and I felt it settle into my bones like morning coffee warming my chest. I made my usual breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast, but this time I ate it while reviewing the evidence Patricia and I had compiled. 3 months of recordings, photographs, forged documents, and witness statements. We had Karen on tape coaching me to lie to doctors. We had Michael's signature on papers he'd never read. We had Dr. Morrison's fraudulent medical report sitting right next to Dr. Peterson's legitimate eye exam from the day before, which certified my vision as completely normal for a woman my age. But most importantly, we had documented proof of what Patricia called the money trail. Every attempt Karen had made to access my accounts, every call to my financial institutions, every step in her plan to liquidate my assets. She'd been sloppy in her confidence, leaving digital footprints everywhere like a burglar who forgot to wear gloves. My phone rang at 8:30 sharp. Karen's voice came through with that sickeningly sweet tone she used when she thought she was winning. "Good morning, Dorothy. I hope you slept well after yesterday's appointment. Dr. Morrison was so thorough, wasn't he? I've already started making some arrangements based on his recommendations." Arrangements? My stomach tightened, but I kept my voice steady and confused. "What kind of arrangements, dear?" "Well, first, I've contacted your bank about transferring your accounts to a joint account with Michael's name on it. Just for safety, you understand. That way, if something happens to you or if you have trouble managing things because of your vision, we can step in immediately." I gripped the phone tighter. "I haven't agreed to any joint accounts, Karen." "Oh, Dorothy, we discussed this, remember? You signed the papers last week giving us financial power of attorney. That allows us to make these decisions for your protection. I know it's confusing, but trust me, this is all perfectly legal and in your best interest." Legal. The word tasted like poison in my mouth. What she was doing was the exact opposite of legal, but she'd counted on my supposed confusion and declining mental state to prevent me from understanding that. "I also spoke with a real estate agent yesterday," Karen continued, her voice getting more animated as she warmed to her subject. "Claire Henderson from Magnolia Realty. She specializes in properties like yours, older homes that need updating. She thinks we could list your house for $350, maybe $375, if we do some cosmetic improvements first. $375,000. For the house where I'd raised my son, where I'd nursed my husband through his final illness, where I'd planned to live out my own days surrounded by 40 years of memories." She was talking about selling my life like it was nothing more than a real estate transaction. "I don't want to sell my house, Karen." I let my voice quiver, playing up the frightened old woman routine one more time. "I know change is scary, Dorothy, but think about how much easier your life will be. We found some lovely senior communities near us. Cedar Grove Estates has beautiful apartments, all on one floor, with medical care right on site. You'd never have to worry about yard work or home repairs again. And the money from your house would pay for several years of care, even after we use some of it to settle your debts." "My debts? That was a new one. What debts, honey?" "I don't have any debts." "Well, there's the money you borrowed from Michael and me for your medical expenses last year, and the loan we gave you when your roof needed repairs. We never asked you to pay us back because you're family. But now that we're managing your finances properly, we need to get everything documented and balanced." I sat in stunned silence. There had been no medical expenses that I hadn't paid myself. My roof had been repaired by my insurance company after a storm damaged. Karen was inventing debts that had never existed, creating a paper trail that would justify draining my accounts even further. "How much do you think I owe you?" I asked carefully. "Well, let's see. The medical expenses were about $15,000. And the roof repairs were another $12, plus interest over the time period. I'd say we're looking at about $30,000 total. Of course, we're family, so we won't charge you the full market interest rate. $30,000, made up out of thin air, but with the financial power of attorney she thought she had, she could simply transfer that money from my accounts to theirs and claim it was debt repayment. The audacity of it took my breath away. "I want to look at my records," I said. "I want to see these debts you're talking about." "Oh, Dorothy, you don't need to worry about the paperwork. That's what we're here for." Besides, with your vision problems, trying to read through all those old records would just strain your eyes unnecessarily. I want to see them anyway. There was a pause on Karen's end, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its saccharine quality. Fine. I'll bring over the documentation this afternoon. But Dorothy, I need you to understand that questioning every decision we make isn't helpful. We're trying to take care of you, and frankly, your suspicion is hurtful. Hurtful. She was stealing my life savings and selling my house, and my suspicion was hurtful. The sheer gall of it almost made me laugh. After Karen hung up, I immediately called Patricia. We'd been planning for this moment, the point where Karen would get aggressive and start moving money around. Now that it was happening, I felt strangely calm. The trap was set, and Karen was walking right into it. She's moving faster than we anticipated, Patricia said after I'd given her the full report. Inventing debts, planning to liquidate assets, talking about forcing you into a care facility. This is textbook financial elder abuse, and she's doing it all while we're recording everything. What's our timeline? We could move today if we had to, but I'd prefer to let her actually attempt the money transfers. Once she tries to steal your funds, we've got her for attempted theft, fraud, and elder abuse. The charges will be much more serious. And Michael? Patricia's voice softened. Dorothy, I know this is hard, but Michael is complicit in all of this. He signed the false power of attorney documents. He's endorsed the fraudulent medical reports. He's been present for conversations where they discussed selling your house without your real consent. Legally, he's just as guilty as Karen. I knew she was right, but it still felt like swallowing broken glass. My boy, my baby, was going to face criminal charges because he'd let his wife convince him to steal from his own mother. Part of me wanted to warn him, to give him a chance to back out before it was too late. But Patricia had been clear. Any interference on my part could compromise the case and let them both escape justice. Karen arrived that afternoon with a thick folder and an attitude that was decidedly less friendly than her morning phone call. She'd brought Michael with her, and they both looked like they'd been arguing in the car. Michael's face was pale and drawn, while Karen's jaw was set in a hard line that made her look older and meaner than her 42 years. Dorothy, she said without preamble, dumping the folder on my kitchen table, I've brought the financial records you wanted to see. I hope this will help you understand the situation better. I opened the folder with trembling hands that weren't entirely an act. Inside were bank statements, receipts, and invoices that looked official at first glance. But as I studied them more carefully, I could see they were masterfully forged documents. Karen had created an entire fictional financial history, showing loans I'd never received, expenses I'd never incurred, and debts I'd never owed. The medical expenses were documented with invoices from a clinic in Biloxi that I'd never visited, for treatments I'd never received. The roof repair bills were from a company that didn't exist, with a phone number that probably went to Karen's cell phone. She'd even created fake email exchanges between herself and me, discussing these non-existent loans and expressing my gratitude for their financial help. I don't remember any of this, I said, which was completely true. That's exactly what we're worried about, Michael said, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. Your memory has been getting worse along with your vision, Mama. That's why we need to take over your finances before you make a mistake that costs you everything. My memory. Now, I was supposedly suffering from dementia as well as blindness. The net was closing around me, or at least they thought it was. In reality, every false claim they made was another nail in the coffin of their criminal case. I want to call Mr. Henderson, I said. I want him to look at these papers. Mr. Henderson is 85 years old and half senile, Karen snapped, her mask finally slipping completely. Besides, we don't have time to wait around for some ancient lawyer to shuffle through paperwork. Dorothy, you need to face reality. You're not competent to manage your own affairs anymore, and fighting us on this is just going to make things harder for everyone. Karen, Michael said quietly, maybe we should slow down a little. Mama seems upset. Mama seems confused, Karen shot back, just like she's been for months. Michael, we've been through this. We can't let sentiment cloud our judgment when Dorothy's safety and financial security are at stake. They were talking about me like I wasn't in the room again, but this time I let them. I wanted them to get comfortable, to say things they'd regret later when those words were played back in court. Look, Karen continued, turning back to me with forced patience. I know this is overwhelming, Dorothy. Change is never easy, especially at your age. But Michael and I have already started the process of protecting your assets. Tomorrow morning, we're going to the bank to transfer your accounts into a joint management structure. Next week, we're meeting with Claire Henderson to list your house. And I've scheduled you for an intake appointment at Cedar Grove Estates for the following Monday. What if I don't want to go? Dorothy, it's not about what you want anymore. It's about what's safe and practical. Dr. Morrison's report clearly states that you're not capable of living independently. We could petition the court for full guardianship if necessary, but I'd prefer to handle this as a family. Guardianship. The ultimate theft, where they would literally own me as if I were a piece of property. Karen was showing her hand completely now, revealing the full scope of her plan to steal not just my money but my freedom, my dignity, my very identity as an independent human being. I need some time to think about all this, I said. There isn't time, Karen replied curtly. Dorothy, I'm sorry if this seems rushed, but your condition is deteriorating rapidly. Every day we wait is another day you could fall, or get confused, or make a financial mistake that costs thousands of dollars. We're doing this because we love you, even if you can't see that right now. Love. The way she said it made the words sound like a curse. This wasn't love. It was predation dressed up in the language of concern and family obligation. After they left, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by the forged documents and felt something shift inside me. The time for playing victim was over. Karen had revealed her entire plan, timeline and all. She was moving against me tomorrow morning, which meant I had to move against her tonight. I called Patricia first, then Detective Ray Coleman from the Hattiesburg Police Department. Ray had been a customer at the bank for 20 years, and I'd helped him navigate some financial difficulties after his divorce. He owed me a favor, and more importantly, he knew me well enough to take me seriously when I told him what was happening. Mrs. Dorothy, he said when I finished explaining the situation, this is one of the most elaborate elder abuse schemes I've ever heard of. How long has this been going on? 3 months of active planning, but I think Karen's been setting this up for over a year. She's been studying me, learning my habits, building a case for my incompetence. And you've been recording everything? Everything. Phone calls, in-person conversations, doctor visits, financial discussions. My attorney has copies of all the evidence, plus the forged documents they showed me today. Ray was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him thinking through the legal implications. Mrs. Dorothy, what they're doing is serious. We're talking about conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, identity theft, forgery, and attempted grand larceny. If convicted, they're looking at significant prison time. Good, I said, and I meant it. When do we move? Tomorrow morning, right before they try to access your bank accounts. We'll let them attempt the theft, then arrest them in the act. Can you be at First National at 9 o'clock? I'll be there. That night I barely slept. Not from fear or anxiety, but from anticipation. Tomorrow, I would stop being the helpless victim and reveal myself as the woman I'd always been. Dorothy Williams, retired head bank teller, expert in financial fraud detection, and nobody's fool. I spent the evening preparing for what Patricia called my, quote, grand revelation. I selected my best navy blue suit, the one I'd worn to important bank meetings. I polished my good shoes and chose my pearls, the ones Michael's father had given me for our 20th anniversary. I wanted to look like the competent, intelligent woman I was when I walked into that bank tomorrow morning. More importantly, I rehearsed what I was going to say. Karen expected to find a confused, frightened old woman who would sign whatever papers they put in front of her. Instead, she was going to encounter a sharp-minded adversary who had been 3 steps ahead of her from the beginning. I also spent time thinking about Michael, about the moment when he would realize what he'd done, what he'd lost. Part of me hoped he would understand that I'd had no choice, that letting them steal from me would have been a betrayal of everything his father and I had worked to build. But another part of me knew that some damage couldn't be undone, some trust couldn't be rebuilt. At 7 o'clock the next morning, my phone rang. Karen's voice was tense and businesslike. Dorothy, Michael and I will pick you up at 8:30. We need to get to the bank right when it opens to handle the account transfers. I hope you're ready to cooperate today, Because I'm not in the mood for any more delays or arguments. I'll be ready, I said, and for the first time in 3 months I wasn't lying. At 8:25, I stood at my front window watching Michael's car pull into my driveway. I felt calm and centered, like I used to feel on busy banking days when everything had to go perfectly. Karen got out of the passenger seat and walked toward my front door with the confident stride of someone who thought she'd already won. But Karen had made one crucial mistake in all her planning. She'd underestimated her opponent, she'd seen a lonely old widow, and assumed that meant weak and stupid. She'd confused my age with my intelligence, my grief with my gullibility. She was about to learn that Dorothy Williams didn't go down without a fight. And this particular fight was going to end with handcuffs, criminal charges, and a very public lesson about what happens when you try to cheat a woman who'd spent 4 decades catching cheaters for a living. I opened the door before she could knock, dressed in my best suit, and wearing my brightest smile. "Good morning, Karen," I said. "I'm ready to go to the bank." What I didn't say was that I was ready to destroy her life, just like she'd tried to destroy mine. Some lessons have to be learned the hard way, and Karen was about to get an education she'd never forget. The drive to First National Bank took 12 minutes, and those were the longest 12 minutes of my life. I sat in the back seat of Michael's sedan, watching the familiar streets of Hattiesburg roll past, while Karen chattered nervously in the front seat about paperwork and procedures. Michael drove in silence, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, looking like a man heading to his own execution. Which, in a way, he was. Karen had a leather briefcase on her lap, stuffed with the forged documents and fraudulent power of attorney papers. She kept checking her phone, making sure the bank manager would be available, confirming that all the, quote, proper documentation was in order. Her confidence was absolute, her manner brisk and professional. She truly believed she was about to pull off the perfect crime. "Now, Dorothy," she said, turning to face me as we pulled into the bank's parking lot, "when we get inside, I need you to let me do most of the talking. Banking procedures can be very confusing, especially with your vision problems, and we don't want any misunderstandings that might delay the process." "Of course, dear," I replied, my voice appropriately meek and confused. "I just want to make sure everything is legal and proper." "Oh, it's completely legal," Karen assured me, her smile sharp as a blade. "I've had attorneys review everything. This is exactly how these situations are supposed to be handled, when elderly family members can no longer manage their own affairs." Attorneys. Another lie to add to the mountain of deception she'd built over the past 3 months. But I simply nodded and gathered my purse, playing the helpless old woman role one last time. First National Bank had been my professional home for 42 years, and walking through those doors felt like coming back to a place where I belonged. The marble floors gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the familiar smell of paper and ink brought back thousands of memories. I'd caught check forgers at that customer service counter. I'd helped solve embezzlement cases in those back offices. I'd built a reputation as someone who could spot financial fraud from a mile away. Today, I was going to use every skill I'd learned in those 4 decades to take down the biggest fraudsters I'd ever encountered. My own family. Susan Martinez, the current bank manager, greeted us with professional courtesy. Susan had been a junior teller when I retired, and I'd helped train her in fraud detection procedures. She knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of, but she played her part perfectly, treating me like any other elderly customer who might need extra assistance. "Mrs. Williams," she said warmly, "how nice to see you. How can we help you today?" Karen immediately stepped forward, taking control of the conversation exactly as she'd planned. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Karen Williams, Dorothy's daughter-in-law. We spoke on the phone yesterday about transferring Dorothy's accounts to joint management due to her declining health." "Yes, of course," Susan replied, glancing briefly at me with what looked like concern. "I have the paperwork ready. If you'd like to step into my office, we can take care of everything privately." We followed Susan into her glass-walled office, the same one where I'd conducted countless official bank business over the years. Karen settled into a chair across from Susan's desk and opened her briefcase with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Michael sat beside her, still silent, still looking like he was going to be sick. I took the chair closest to the door, playing the confused elderly relative who wasn't sure why she was there. But what Karen and Michael didn't know was that Detective Ray Coleman was sitting in the bank's lobby, dressed like any other customer, watching everything through the glass walls of Susan's office. They also didn't know that our entire conversation was being recorded by equipment Patricia had helped me set up. "Here's the medical documentation from Dr. Morrison," Karen said, sliding the fraudulent report across Susan's desk. "As you can see, Dorothy's vision has deteriorated to the point where she can no longer safely manage financial transactions." Susan examined the papers with appropriate seriousness, though I knew she was really looking for the telltale signs of forgery that I'd taught her to recognize years ago. "This does seem quite serious," she said carefully. "Mrs. Williams, how do you feel about these proposed changes to your account management?" Before I could answer, Karen jumped in again. "Dorothy understands that this is necessary for her own protection. She's already signed power of attorney documents giving Michael and me authority to manage her finances." Karen pulled out the fake power of attorney papers, the ones I'd signed thinking they were worthless decoys. She spread them across Susan's desk with the confidence of someone who believed they held legal weight. Susan picked up the documents and studied them carefully. "These appear to be in order," she said, though her tone suggested she was reading from a script. "However, I do need to verify a few details with Mrs. Williams directly, as per bank policy." "Of course," Karen said, though I could see irritation flicker across her face. "But please keep in mind that Dorothy's comprehension may be limited due to her condition." Susan turned to me with professional kindness. "Mrs. Williams, I need to ask you directly. Do you understand what these documents mean? And do you consent to having your accounts managed by your son and daughter-in-law?" This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment when I would stop being the victim and reveal myself as the woman I'd always been. I straightened in my chair, looked Susan directly in the eye, and spoke in a voice that was clear, strong, and completely different from the confused whisper I'd been using for months. "Ms. Martinez," I said, "I need to speak with you privately. What these people are trying to do is illegal, and I have evidence to prove it." The silence in that office was so complete I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Karen's mouth fell open, and Michael went pale as printer paper. Susan maintained her professional composure, but I could see the relief in her eyes. "I'm sorry," Karen stammered, "but Dorothy is clearly confused. This is exactly the kind of episode we've been worried about. Sometimes she has these moments where she thinks people are trying to hurt her." "I'm not confused, Karen," I said, standing up and walking to Susan's desk. "I'm Dorothy Williams, head teller at this bank for 42 years, and I know fraud when I see it. These power of attorney documents are fake. The medical report is based on a fraudulent examination by a doctor who's committed malpractice. And the debts you claim I owe you never existed." I opened my purse and pulled out a manila folder containing copies of all the evidence Patricia and I had compiled. Real medical reports from Dr. Peterson showing my vision was normal. Bank records proving I'd never borrowed money from Michael and Karen. Recordings of conversations where Karen coached me to lie to doctors and discussed selling my house without my consent. "Ms. Martinez," I continued, "I'd like you to call the police. These people have been planning to steal my life savings, and they're attempting to do it right now, in your bank, using forged documents." Karen shot to her feet, her face flushed with anger and panic. "This is ridiculous. Dorothy, you're having another episode. Michael, tell her. Tell Miss Martinez about your mother's condition." But Michael was staring at me like he was seeing a ghost. The realization was dawning on him that the confused, helpless old woman he thought he'd been protecting was actually the sharp-minded adversary who'd been documenting his every crime for months. "Mama," he said quietly, "how long have you known?" "I've known since the day I overheard you and Karen in the grocery store parking lot, planning to steal my house and put me in a nursing home," I replied. "I've been recording your conversations, documenting your attempts to access my accounts, and building a criminal case against both of you for the past 3 months." The color drained completely from Michael's face. "Mama, we were trying to help you. We thought you were getting confused, making mistakes. Karen said you needed protection." "Karen said a lot of things, honey. Most of them lies." I turned to face my daughter-in-law, who was now frantically stuffing papers back into her briefcase. "Did you really think I was stupid enough not to notice what you were doing?" Did you think 42 years of banking experience just evaporated when I turned 70? You're sick, Karen hissed, abandoning all pretense of concern. There's something wrong with you, Dorothy. Normal people don't spy on their own families. Normal families don't steal from their elderly relatives, I shot back. Normal daughters-in-law don't forge medical reports and create fake debts to justify theft. Susan had been quietly making phone calls during our exchange, and now she stood up with professional authority. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you both to remain here until the police arrive. Mrs. Williams has presented serious allegations of fraud, and the bank has a legal obligation to erase and investigate any suspected financial crimes. This is insane, Karen said, but her voice was losing its conviction. Michael, we need to leave now. Nobody's leaving, a deep voice said from the doorway. Detective Ray Coleman stepped into the office, his badge visible on his belt. Karen Williams, Michael Williams, you're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit elder abuse, attempted grand theft, fraud, and identity theft. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity that felt both surreal and deeply satisfying. Ray read them their rights, while Susan called bank security. Karen protested loudly, demanding lawyers and threatening lawsuits, but her voice had taken on a high, panicked quality that told everyone she knew she was caught. Michael said nothing. He simply sat in his chair, staring at me with a mixture of shock, betrayal, and something that might have been respect. When the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he finally spoke. Mama, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know how this got so out of hand. I looked at my son, my baby, the boy I'd raised to be honest and decent, and felt my heart break a little. I'm sorry too, honey, but you made your choice when you decided to steal from me instead of talking to me. As they led Karen and Michael out of the bank in handcuffs, I remained in Susan's office, feeling a strange mixture of triumph and grief. I'd won, but the victory had cost me my relationship with my son and any hope of a normal family dynamic with my grandchildren. Patricia arrived within the hour, bringing with her a team of federal investigators who were interested in Dr. Morrison's role in the scheme. Apparently, fraudulent medical evaluations to support elder abuse cases were becoming a significant problem, and my evidence might help them build cases against other corrupt physicians. Dorothy, Patricia said as we watched the investigators box up Karen's forged documents. You did exactly the right thing. What they were planning would have destroyed your life. I know, I replied, but it still hurts. Of course it does, but you protected yourself, and you've probably prevented them from doing this to other vulnerable elderly people. Karen's methods were too sophisticated for this to be their first attempt. The investigation that followed revealed that Patricia was right. Karen had been involved in similar schemes in Jackson and Meridian before she married Michael. She'd targeted wealthy elderly individuals, often through family connections, and had stolen over $500,000 in the past 5 years. My case was just the latest in a pattern of predatory behavior that had destroyed multiple families. Dr. Morrison's license was revoked, and he faced federal charges for his role in the conspiracy. The fake medical reports he'd prepared for Karen weren't just unethical. They were evidence of a broader criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. As for Michael, he eventually pled guilty to lesser charges in exchange for testifying against Karen. His lawyer argued that he'd been manipulated by his wife, that he genuinely believed I was suffering from dementia and vision problems. The court showed some mercy, but he still faced 2 years of probation and community service. The hardest part was explaining everything to Emma and Tyler. They were old enough to understand that their mother had tried to steal from me, but young enough to be devastated by the destruction of their family. I made sure they knew that none of this was their fault, that they would always be welcome in my home, regardless of what their parents had done. Emma, wise beyond her 16 years, asked me the question that had been haunting me since the arrests. Grandma, how did you stay so calm through all of this? How did you keep pretending when you knew what they were doing? I thought about it for a long moment before answering. Honey, when you get to be my age, you learn that sometimes the best way to catch someone doing wrong is to let them think they're getting away with it. Your mama thought she was smarter than an old lady from Mississippi. She found out different. But the truth was more complicated than that. I'd stayed calm because I'd had to, because the alternative was letting them win. I'd spent my whole life working, saving, and building something to leave to my family. I wasn't about to let anyone, even my own son, steal that legacy out from under me. The legal proceedings took 8 months to resolve completely. Karen was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for elder abuse and fraud. Michael served 6 months in county jail and was required to repay the money he'd attempted to steal, plus damages and court costs. Dr. Morrison lost his medical license and received a 3-year sentence for his role in the conspiracy. Throughout it all, I maintained my dignity and my independence. I kept living in my house by the Leaf River, tending my garden and playing poker with the river rats. But I'd learned something important about trust, about family, and about the difference between being old and being helpless. I was 73 years old, and I'd just proven that experience and wisdom could triumph over youth and arrogance. Karen had underestimated me because of my age, but age had been my greatest weapon. I'd had decades to learn how people behaved, how fraud worked, and how to turn the tables on those who thought they could take advantage of me. The confrontation at the bank had lasted less than an hour, but it had taken me 3 months of careful planning to orchestrate. It was the most important performance of my life, and I'd played my role perfectly. When the curtain came down and the handcuffs came out, everyone finally saw Dorothy Williams as she really was. Not a victim, but a force to be reckoned with. 6 months after the arrests, I stood in my kitchen making coffee and watching the sunrise paint the Leaf River golden through my window. The house felt different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because I had changed. The woman who'd pretended to be helpless and confused was gone, replaced by someone who'd rediscovered her own strength in the most unlikely way. The legal battles were finally over. Karen had been transferred to federal prison in Alabama, where she'd spend the next 4 years paying for her crimes. Michael had completed his sentence and was living in a small apartment across town, working as a construction supervisor and trying to rebuild his life. We spoke occasionally, careful conversations that danced around the enormous betrayal that still stood between us like a wall neither of us knew how to tear down. But the real transformation wasn't in the legal outcomes or the prison sentences. It was in how I saw myself, how I moved through the world, how I claimed space that had always been mine but that I'd somehow forgotten I owned. The first change came when I decided to renovate the house, not because it needed updating, but because I wanted to. For years, I'd lived quietly, making do with furniture that was functional but not beautiful, keeping my presence small and unobtrusive. But after spending months pretending to be invisible while catching criminals, I discovered I was tired of being invisible for real. I hired contractors to expand the kitchen, adding a window seat where I could drink my morning coffee and watch the birds. I converted the spare bedroom into a library, with floor-to-ceiling shelves for the books I'd collected over 73 years. I planted a vegetable garden twice the size of my old one, with raised beds that were easier on my knees, and a greenhouse where I could start seedlings in winter. The money for all this came from an unexpected source. The federal investigation into Karen's crimes had recovered assets from her previous victims, and the court had awarded me a substantial settlement as compensation for the emotional distress and financial harm she'd caused. Karen had thought she was stealing from a helpless old woman, but instead she'd funded my renaissance. More importantly, I started saying yes to things I'd been too tired or too careful to try before. When the Hattiesburg Historical Society asked me to give a presentation about banking in the 1980s, I didn't demur or suggest they find someone more qualified. I researched, prepared slides, and delivered a talk that had the audience asking questions for 45 minutes afterward. When Margaret suggested we start a consulting business helping other elderly people protect themselves from financial fraud, I didn't worry about whether I was too old to start a new career. We rented a small office downtown and began offering services that drew clients from across southern Mississippi. Turns out there were a lot of families like mine, and a lot of elderly people who needed someone who understood both the legal system and the psychology of family betrayal. Our first case was a 78-year-old farmer named Robert Hayes, whose grandson had been slowly draining his accounts by claiming the money was for farm equipment that never materialized. Robert had suspected something was wrong but hadn't known how to investigate or what to do about it. Margaret and I helped him document the theft, recover his money, and prosecute his grandson for fraud. The work was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. Every case we solved, every elderly person we helped protect their assets, felt like a small victory against the kind of predatory behavior that had nearly destroyed my own family. I was using skills I'd developed over 4 decades in banking, combined with hard-won knowledge about family manipulation and elder abuse, to help people who had nowhere else to turn. But the biggest transformation was in my relationship with my grandchildren. Emma and Tyler had been devastated by their parents' divorce and their mother's imprisonment, but they'd also been watching their grandmother navigate an impossible situation with grace and strength. Instead of seeing me as the victim of their mother's crimes, they began to see me as the hero who'd refused to be victimized. Emma, now 17 and preparing for college, started coming by every weekend to help with the consulting business. She had a sharp mind for detail and a natural skepticism that made her excellent at spotting inconsistencies in financial documents. She wanted to study criminal justice in college, she told me, because she'd seen firsthand how criminals could hide behind family relationships and concern for the elderly. Tyler, 15 and still quiet like his grandfather had been, found his voice through art. He started a series of drawings depicting elderly people as superheroes, fighting off various villains who represented different types of elder abuse. His art teacher entered one of his pieces in a statewide contest, and it won first place in the high school division. The drawing showed an elderly woman in a cape, standing triumphant over a pile of defeated figures, holding fake documents and forged checks. "That's you, Grandma Dot," he told me when he brought home the blue ribbon. "You're the superhero who saved yourself." The description made me laugh, but it also made me think about how dramatically my self-perception had shifted. For months after my husband's death, I'd seen myself as someone whose best days were behind her, whose role was to be helpful and unobtrusive and grateful for whatever attention her family was willing to give her. The woman who'd moved in with Michael and Karen had been someone who took up as little space as possible, who apologized for her presence, and tried to earn her place through service. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who knew her own worth, who understood that age and experience were strengths rather than weaknesses, who refused to make herself small for anyone's convenience. The change was most evident in how I handled Michael's attempts at reconciliation. He started calling regularly about 3 months after his release from jail, always beginning the conversations with apologies and ending them with requests to rebuild our relationship. I listened politely, but I didn't rush to forgive or forget. "Mama," he said during one particularly difficult conversation, "I know I hurt you, but I really thought you were getting confused. Karen showed me evidence, convinced me you needed protection. I was trying to be a good son." "Michael," I replied, "a good son would have talked to me directly about his concerns. A good son would have gotten a second medical opinion before accepting that his mother was incompetent. A good son wouldn't have signed legal documents without reading them or let his wife forge debts that never existed." The silence on his end of the phone stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, he spoke again, his voice smaller than I'd heard it since he was a child. "How do I make this right, Mama? How do I earn your trust back?" "I don't know if you can," I told him honestly. "Trust isn't something you can demand or even earn through apologies. It's something that grows slowly, through consistent actions over time. Right now, I'm not sure you understand the magnitude of what you participated in. I was trying to protect you." "No, Michael, you were trying to avoid conflict with your wife. There's a difference." These conversations were painful, but they were also necessary. I wasn't going to pretend that everything was fine just to make Michael feel better about his choices. He was going to have to live with the consequences of his actions, just like I was living with the consequences of mine. But perhaps the most surprising transformation was in how other people began to see and treat me. Word of what had happened spread through Hattiesburg's small community, as word always does in small southern towns. But instead of seeing me as a victim or an object of pity, people began treating me with a respect that bordered on awe. The story that made the rounds wasn't about a helpless old woman who'd been taken advantage of by her family. It was about a retired bank teller who'd outwitted criminals using her professional skills and personal courage. I became known as the woman who'd pretended to be going blind while secretly building a federal case against her own daughter-in-law. Grocery store clerks asked for my advice about protecting their elderly parents. Neighbors invited me to speak at their church groups about financial fraud prevention. The police department asked me to help train officers in recognizing signs of elder abuse. I'd spent years feeling invisible, but now I was more visible than I'd ever wanted to be. The difference was that this time the attention was based on my competence, rather than my neediness, my strength, rather than my vulnerability. One morning in late spring, almost a year after the arrests, I was working in my garden when a car pulled into my driveway. I looked up to see a woman about Karen's age getting out of a blue sedan, followed by an elderly man who moved carefully with a walker. The woman introduced herself as Linda Morrison, and the elderly man was her father Frank. She'd heard about my consulting work through the Hattiesburg grapevine, and wanted to know if I could help them with a situation involving Frank's finances and his live-in caregiver. We sat on my back porch, drinking sweet tea and talking through the details of their case. Frank suspected his caregiver was stealing from him, but he wasn't sure how to prove it. The caregiver had convinced him that his memory was failing, that he was confused about his finances, that he needed her to handle his money for his own protection. The parallels to my own experience were so obvious they made my chest tight. But instead of feeling triggered or upset, I felt energized. This was exactly the kind of case Margaret and I had started our business to handle. "Mr. Frank," I said, "how's your eyesight?" He looked confused by the question. "My eyes? They're fine. Why?" "Because if your vision is good, we can set up some surveillance equipment to catch your caregiver in the act. Sometimes the best way to catch a thief is to let them think no one's watching." Linda's eyes widened. "You mean spy on her?" "I mean document criminal activity so we can prosecute it," I corrected. "Just like I did with my own family." We spent the next 2 hours planning an investigation that would either prove Frank's suspicions or put his mind at ease. I felt the familiar satisfaction of using my skills to solve a problem, of helping someone who was being taken advantage of by someone they trusted. As Linda and Frank prepared to leave, Linda turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Williams, I can't thank you enough. Dad's been so worried, so confused about whether he could trust his own perceptions. Just knowing that someone believes him, someone who's been through something similar, means everything." After they drove away, I sat on my porch watching the sun set over the river and thinking about how much my life had changed. A year ago, I'd been the one who was confused and worried, uncertain whether I could trust my own perceptions. Now I was the one offering guidance and support to others facing similar challenges. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was professional, social, and spiritual. I'd rediscovered not just my own strength but my purpose. At 74 years old, I was busier and more fulfilled than I'd been in decades. That evening, Emma called to tell me she'd been accepted to the University of Mississippi with a scholarship to study criminal justice. Tyler had been selected for a summer art program at the Mississippi Museum of Art. Both of them were thriving despite the chaos their parents had brought into their lives, and both credited our relationship with helping them understand that adversity could be overcome with intelligence, courage, and patience. "Grandma Dot," Emma said before hanging up, "I want you to know that watching you handle everything that happened with Mom and Dad taught me something important. You showed me that being strong doesn't mean being loud or aggressive. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay calm, gather your evidence, and wait for the right moment to act." After the call ended, I walked through my house, turning off lights and locking doors, preparing for another peaceful night in the home I'd fought to keep. The rooms looked different now, filled with new furniture and fresh paint, but also filled with a sense of pride and ownership that had nothing to do with money or possessions. I'd learned that transformation doesn't always look like what you expect. Sometimes it looks like an elderly woman pretending to be confused while secretly recording conversations. Sometimes it looks like choosing justice over family harmony. Sometimes it looks like starting a new career at an age when most people are slowing down. But most importantly, I'd learned that age doesn't diminish your value or your agency. If anything, it enhances them. Every year I'd lived, every challenge I'd faced, every skill I'd developed had prepared me for the moment when I needed to save myself from people who thought my age made me helpless. Karen had said my eyes were going bad, that I couldn't see clearly anymore. She was wrong. My vision had never been clearer. I could see exactly who she was, exactly what she was doing, and exactly how to stop her. And now, a year later, I could see my future stretching ahead of me. More cases to solve, more elderly people to help, more grandchildren to guide, more gardens to plant, more books to read, more life to live on my own terms. They'd tried to convince me I was too old to see clearly. Instead, they'd taught me to see more clearly than ever before. And what I saw was a woman who'd spent 74 years learning how to be strong, wise, and absolutely unstoppable. That was the real transformation. Not just surviving what they'd tried to do to me, but using it to become more myself than I'd ever been before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.